Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm about to introduce you. So, Dr. Jeremy Stoll is a queer comics creator and scholar whose research focuses on comics in and of India. Stoll's articles have appeared in the International Journal of Comic Art, Mark, a magazine of the arts, the Routledge Companions of Comics, and the award-winning The Comics World, Comics, Graphic Novels, and Their Publics with Benjamin Wu. They're currently working on Turn the Page, illustrating India's comic scene with Shreyas Krishnan, Vidyu Sakhani, and Mara Thacker. They're also committed to comics work on the ineffable in life, including autobio work in Rainbow Reflections, body image comics by queer men, and a comic essay in a forthcoming volume of X-Men, the animated series. Welcome, Dr. Jeremy Stoll.
Thank you to everybody there at CXC and accommodating me moving online. I'm unfortunately still recovering from COVID. Didn't want to expose anybody to undue risk. But yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about activism and experimentation in Indian comics. So I'm going to be highlighting some threads in the history of comics in and of India, but I want to emphasize this is an incomplete history. And yeah, I'm going to try to basically use these two threads to illustrate the many, many ways that Indian comics history really defies expectations and the need generally for us to be careful with other worlds of comics, to recognize our own biases, to try to set those aside and be open to all the many ways that comics and comics creators exist in the world. I'm also going to be coughing and sniffling quite a bit, so apologies, but please bear with me. If there are any images or authors that I go over too fast, I know this material a little too well, so feel free to reach out by email. My email is jstoll@ccad.edu, and I'd be happy to share information, resources, recommendations if you're interested in further exploring this comics world. All right, so what we've got here at the very start is just a couple images to kind of get you interested, but that central one is going to be where we start. And from there, we'll explore some of these different threads. Oop. So generally speaking, the Avad Punch is one of the earliest recognizably comicsy things in India. Now, I'm going to contest that in a little bit, but we'll start there. So the Avad Punch, or Oud Punch, came out in 1877 and ran through the 1950s, but it was part of a larger group of comics and political cartoon magazines in the 19th century. So from 1850 to 1857, another publication ran that could be seen as also an even earlier version of comics, namely the Delhi Sketchbook. It included a lot of articles and kind of commentary, but it also included political cartoons and comics like this one, critiquing the young men of genius by showing how sloppy and unkempt they are. But what was really interesting about this era is just the explosion of these kinds of magazines. So not just the Avad Punch or Oud Punch, but magazines like the Indian Charivari, shorter run magazines like the Delhi Sketchbook were part of this wave of satirical magazines that came about in response to and as part of colonial British Punch magazines, where they were bringing over their own cartoons, essays, and poetry. And a lot of local people thought, well, what the heck not? Let's do it ourselves. Around 70 ended up being published in more than a dozen cities in Northwest India, according to Hassan. But generally speaking, there were probably even more than that. They created a kind of foundation for a critically aware and regionally diverse comics world in India, and that these were published in a lot of different languages and in a lot of different places. So they were published in Tamil, Bangla, Malayalam. There were lots of potentialities coming out of this, basically. What's interesting is that from here, we see a lot of different people picking up on comics because these magazines have such influence. Two really big, important kind of people in this history were artists. One was a poet, C. Subramania Bharati, Oh shoot, I don't have an image for his work, but he published Tamil language comics in the Weekly India magazine and elsewhere. But another probably familiar name for some folks would be Gaganendranath Tagore, who published cartoons in the Modern Review in the 19 teens and later in portfolios and lithographs. Here's an example called A Noble Man. Tagore is a really prominent artist as well, and someone who's really well known. And both Tagore and Subramania Bharati ended up kind of sharing this interest in and love for visual narratives. While World War I ended up bringing about a pause in a lot of these publications, they proliferated a lot afterwards. So we see the growth of cartoons and cartoonists in the South, in Tamil Nadu. We see the rise of British and Indian magazine publications, especially out of the 1920s, in a lot of different regions. And by the 1930s, really cartoonists are kind of a celebrated artist group, much like we see in other parts of the world. The medium is becoming increasingly popular through a lot of different artists who are publishing in a lot of different ways. This includes folks like Tamil artist Mali, who published his work in Indian Express and Ananda Vikatan, one of the state's first popular periodicals. But it also includes some stuff that might be unexpected, like Chandamama. Chandamama was a family-owned monthly children's magazine that was founded by film producers B. Nagi Reddy and Chakrapani in 1947. It's really well known for compelling illustrations and oral storytelling style alongside translations into regional languages. And then over time, as it's continued to be a prominent publishing platform, it's moved into digital platforms. So this is something that's older, but it's also still around and continues to have a lot of power. At the time, it was important because it was part of a lot of children's magazines that were also using comics and cartoons. Two other folks that I want to mention before I get into the threads that I want to focus on are R.K. Lakshman and Mario de Miranda. So R.K. Lakshman was based in Mysore, and he was known for his character, The Common Man, in his You Said It comic strip, which started in 1951. This is a still prominent comics character who makes searing kind of satirical commentary. Miranda, on the other hand, was really well known for his illustrations of Goa and everyday life in Goa. He is well known for books like Goa with Love. He's done a lot of mural artwork in Goa and elsewhere. Both had a lot of influence, not just because of their individual kinds of works, but because they were both cartoonists working for the Times of India, sharing and kind of proliferating the popularity of comics and cartoons. So I want to dive into some of the stuff that you, if you are aware of Indian comics, are probably more familiar with, which is stuff that looks like what we would expect comics to look like. And then I'll dive into the more experimental and more activist work. So Indradjal Comics is one of the kind of first indigenous comic books. Even that terminology is tricky because they started off by publishing Phantom. You may recognize our main figure on the cover here. They were debating between Superman and Phantom as a kind of comic to start publishing in newspapers and elsewhere. And basically, Indradjal Comics worked with the Times of India to put out these comic book republications of Phantom. Now, that probably wouldn't be as important, although Phantom became a really prominent character and pop culture figure in India, if not for Indrajal's Bahadur comics, created with Abid Sorti and several other artists, including Govind Brahmania. This was one of India's first superheroes, kind of. He was a detective who worked to solve various crimes around the country. A lot of the stories included commentary about breaking news and issues at the time. And it was published in multiple languages with a diversity of characters, including one of my favorites, a girlfriend who, for some of her tenure in the comics, kicked ass. But there were other kinds of comic book publications that came of the folk behind Indradjal. So in particular, a man named Anant Pai, or Uncle Pai, as a lot of folks will refer to him in India and in the diaspora, was one of the first people working with the Times of India group on Indradjal, but he left to work on Amar Chitrakatha, or Our Immortal Picture Stories. These are probably the most well-known comic books out of India, and so I wanted to make sure to bring them up. If you've seen comics from or about India, you've probably seen some Amar Chitrakatha comics. They are not uncontroversial. They are really important because Anand Pai was able to find a huge audience for these publications. They started in the late 60s, initially focusing on European fairy tales, but with the Krishna issue, switched over to Hindu mythology. Pai saw these as a way to inculcate cultural values into kids. And it was part of, unfortunately, a larger Hindutva nationalist moment where there was this need to bring back traditional values that often brought in conservative values and violence and xenophobia as well as misogyny and other issues. So whereas there are a lot of these folks who were involved in making Amar Chitrakatha or just excited about making comics, there's kind of a pattern with these comics where women are often portrayed as sex objects, not always. A lot of Muslim representation is really terrible in these early comics. It changes over time because they're still making some of these comics. It's a very long-lived publication platform, but it's kind of tricky to talk about in terms of its influence. It's good in many ways, but it's also got problematic aspects as well. We can still see it coming into a lot of people's awareness of comics or understanding of comics in India, because this is, generally speaking, something a lot of folks will read in school. So a lot of these collections include multiple stories created based on historical research and then shared as an educational tool. Oh, and I should note, Pai himself framed these comics as a kind of cultural heritage that was recognized by UNESCO. At the same time, there's a lot more than just Amar Chitrakatha. As Ryan Holmberg has demonstrated, there were a lot of regional comics magazines that were already established in the 1960s, especially in Bengal. This is an example from Shuktara, a children's magazine similar to Chandamama, but got a lot more kind of a range in terms of the comics that it included. It rose to success in the 1950s. You also have Bengali creators like Narayan Debnath and his really important character Batul the Great. These were also very early superhero-like characters, in some ways more so than Bahadur, who were really important in that area and also continue to influence creators today and readers as well. There were many folks who were active during this time, including Prasad Ray, Mayuk Chaduri, Pratul Chandra Lahiri. This is an example from Mayuk Chaduri's work. So we're seeing some range here. We've got kind of crime stories, superhero-like stories, mystery stories. We get the rise of creators like Pran with Diamond Comics entering the publication world in the 1970s as part of a kind of Hindi pulp publishing platform. This one continues to be quite influential, and Pran's work as part of Pran's features, including especially Chacha Todori, continue to be influential for a lot of comics creators and readers. But there's also work like Detective Moochwala by Ajit Nanan, which came out as part of the Target magazine. Sorry, it's Nainan. Came out as part of Target magazine, another kids magazine, but it very much appealed to kids and adults at the same time and was extremely influential. Nainan, unfortunately, recently passed away, but is generally seen as one of the biggest names in Indian comics. And then in the 1980s and 90s, we see a shift in publications to publishers like Raj Comics in particular. Raj Comics ended up being really important because they were one of the few comics publishers to really do well through the 80s and 90s. They are continuing to publish a lot of superhero comics. And you can see from this cover, they're kind of simultaneously invoking Western superhero comic books and regional kind of spiritual, religious, mythological imagery. And it's part of a kind of larger trend you'll see in a lot of comic books in and of India still, where there's that evocation of mythological imagery or character design at the same time that they're playing with pop culture from a lot of different influences. Raj Comics in particular has grown a lot. There are a lot of different characters. They've had a lot of influence. They're not uncontroversial either in that they have a lot of portrayals of violence. There's a lot of critique of the way that their characters are designed in terms of misogyny and other issues as well. But this is kind of the larger landscape we're dealing with when we're talking about comics in India. But that's not really all of it. This is generally what you're going to see when you're talking to folks who are trying to explain to you what comics in India might look like, or when you're just kind of dipping your foot in. If you're lucky, you'll get a lot of this stuff. More likely, you'll just encounter Amar Chitrakatha, maybe Raj Comics, or Diamond. So I wanted to highlight one thread within comics in India that I think is extremely important, which is comics that are kind of activist in nature or that are doing social commentary. And this comes out of a couple of important works in the history of comics in India. We've seen that those early comics, the Avad Punch, the Ood Punch, as well as those magazines in general, were really focused on political cartooning and social commentary. So it makes sense that this thread would continue. We even have a not pious part of Amar Chitrakatha emphasizing educating kids, but inculcating cultural values. So there's definitely that kind of connection throughout. Another pair of creators I want to highlight here who were extremely influential, I lost the thread, are E.P. Uni and Manjula Padmanabhan. So E.P. Uni, or Ekanath Padmanabhan Uni, carried on the work of those earlier cartoonists I mentioned, Mario Miranda and Lakshman, where he's very much carrying on political cartooning, and he continues to practice to this day. He's putting out comic strips like this one, pointing out the issues with our current government in India. Manjula Padmanabhan is less active in comics these days, but was really important for her Suki comic strip in the I'm forgetting the dates. I've got them right here. I think it was 1980s and 90s. Yeah, from 1982 to 86 in the Sunday Observer, and then in Delhi's Pioneer from 91 to 97. She faced a lot of criticism for these comic strips because she was portraying women very honestly. So we have here an example of Suki trying to meditate, but she talks about body image, she talks about sexism, she talks about fears of assault. And she became a really important figure in comics because she set this really great precedent for talking about these issues in comics, especially in a kind of bright, vibrant, fun way, where one of Suki's main kind of side characters is a frog that talks. So pretty fun while also dealing with these really heavy issues. When we get into long-form comics or graphic novels in India, we see these threads becoming much more important. So in 1994, Arijit Sen put out The River of Stories, which was based on protests against the damming of the Narmada River Valley and the displacement of Adivasi tribal peoples there. He created this work, which I'm just showing a small piece from, kind of imagining a journalist going in and talking to people there, but then doing research himself with those communities and trying to represent their worldview. So you see kind of mythological figures interacting with developers within River of Stories and talking about displacement of culture, displacement of people, talking about the kind of dissonance that urban communities felt where they just wanted power and they didn't really think about the fact that getting hydroelectric power would be harming other people. So trying to bring the kind of environmental and ecological justice harms of development home to an urban population through comics. And so Sen really sets this important precedent with one of the earliest kind of long form comics, which wasn't even that long. It was about 60-ish pages or so. It's recently been republished and updated, which is awesome. You should definitely try to get a copy, which is much easier than it's been in the past. But it also really brought forward this thread of kind of social commentary that ends up kind of being rather important to a lot of long form comics creators and works moving forward. So in the 2000s, we see creators putting out more long-form comics. So Sen really kind of started this off a bit and brought some inspiration for some of these folks. Sarnath Banerjee put out Corridor in 2003, I believe, which was not inherently political, but definitely social commentary, kind of representing a city very much like Delhi, but kind of taking liberty in some ways and showing the ways that changes to the city were affecting people's lives. Amrita Patil put out a queer long-form comic called Kari, where the queerness was not even kind of at the fore of the story. It was a story about a woman who happened to be in love with another woman. And that really changed a lot of comics readers' perspectives on comics, where we see a lot of creators even to this day noting that Patil influenced them to make queer comics because it seemed so easy that it was just there. It wasn't easy, of course, but it provided this kind of early precedent for making queer comics without politicizing that queerness and really focusing more so on the storytelling. Raj Comics for the Hard-Headed came out in, oh gosh, I'm going to mess up the date here, but I think it's 2009. This is by Amitabh Kumar. And it is kind of activist in its own way because he's basically arguing that Raj Comics, the publisher, doesn't get enough credit for their importance, and uses a lot of research about the publisher to show that we should be really valuing those publications a lot more because they had a lot of influence and really brought a lot of comics folks into comics. Parsmita Singh is a fascinating comics creator because she does so much. She's organized edited volumes, written prose, done nonfiction. She's also an educational researcher in the Northeast in India, and works with social issues in Assam to some extent. But at the Hotel at the End of the World is intentionally not clearly political, even though it is. It's about a young girl kind of living in this place where she feels alienated and hearing these stories, and how she receives that, and also like how her world changes. So it's not explicitly connected, but it is intended in many ways by Parsmita Singh to be a kind of important work for its readers. We get more explicit over time with creators like Vishwajyoti Ghosh and his work Delhi Calm, illustrating the Troubles period in India and kind of playing with how to represent that time period and political censorship and fascistic tendencies in governance, where he is very much making social kinds of commentary that a lot of readers really picked up on and valued. And we see that becoming much more important with works like Bhimayana, where this was specifically designed by the publisher to be originally a manga by traditional Indian painters that told the life of an important social activist, Ambedkar, a leader within the marginalized and extremely discriminated against Dalit community in India. But what it became was actually a very collaborative piece where these Gond folk painters took the medium of comics and made it their own. And I'll show a sample page from this because it's really remarkable. They kind of create their own version of a sequential arts form that's still comics, but also still very much Gond traditional art. And there's, of course, a lot of other works happening that I didn't even have the chance to mention. Some of them are very explicitly social justice oriented, like World Comics India. So I wanted to make sure to bring up the work of this nonprofit and Suraj Sharma, a very important figure within comics in India because he's bringing it to a lot of villages, he's bringing it to nonprofits. He very much sees comics as a development communication medium, which kind of goes against a lot of other creators' understandings of the medium, but he's also bringing in this very social justice-minded approach that is not at all uncommon. Comic scholars like Carleen McLean have written about Viva Lot Comics, a publisher that was explicitly framing literacy and awareness of traditional narratives for kids as a kind of justice initiative, while also grounding it within kind of ethnographic research. There've been a lot of publications like that and a lot of creators trying to put forth political and social agendas through comics. What that often leads to is actually experimentation, because in order to play with the form and put forth a social kind of understanding, there's often a reframing of what art or communication are. So one of the more important threads here, which comic scholar John Lett notes, among many others, is the tradition of Parachitra picture scrolls and these kind of ways of viewing narrative as a kind of simultaneous uh, kind of framing of time. There have been several publications that have played with the Parachitra style. So this is a traditional Parachitra scroll painter in Bengal. These are long form kind of narratives, but they are vertical scrolls. So you will go through these multiple frames sometimes, or single large kind of representations of events like a flood or 9/11 or contemporary politics, or even local events or even movies. A lot of these are sold to tourists. They take a lot of different forms and are very inventive because they're competing to make a living. They are also generally going to be paired with a performance of song. The tourist objects less so. They're more likely to be just sold as tourist objects. And there is some controversy over these kinds of traditional artworks increasingly being present in kind of modern art galleries, where the artists aren't necessarily getting paid much, but the art gallery owners may be getting quite a bit. So comics-wise, we've seen folks explicitly take up the Parachitra style, working with traditional painters to create graphic novels. I See the Promised Land is an example that was unfortunately heavily critiqued at the time. It's about the life of Martin Luther King Jr. by an American writer who then had the script adapted with these traditional painters. A lot of folks have noted a big issue here would be that there probably wasn't much collaboration. Um, this was something that was really driven by the kind of potential for this to be like a coffee table book, I'm guessing. But there are works like Sita's Ramayana by Samhita Arni and Moina Chitrakar, where the collaboration is much clearer. You have an image that will appear in multiple panels within the book as your eye is supposed to move through the scroll, which was painted but not included necessarily in that form in the book. And this is a kind of feminist retelling of the epic Ramayana through Sita's eyes. So there is experimentation in trying to put forth different tellings of stories to have that kind of educational social agenda. Oh no, I messed up my image orientation here. This is an example of another important form called Kaligat paintings. These were religious kinds of paintings often sold by temples and during religious events that would have been, well, they take a lot of different forms. They don't necessarily have to just be of gods or religious figures, but they have a huge influence on a lot of creators. Again, apologies that my images aren't quite set up properly here. But RSVP by Vishwajyoti Ghosh clearly has some of this kind of stylistic influence of Kaligat paintings. And in interviews about his work, he points out that this is one of the stylistic kind of traditions for him that's important visually. So part of it is not just about what you're trying to do with the medium, but about an individual experience of the medium. So for Ghosh, Kaligat painting is clearly part of the visual narrative history of India and the heritage he's drawing on in making comics. And to go back to Bhimayana, this is an example that kind of shows some of the visual innovation involved in this particular work, where we have panels that are often alive as part of the tradition of God folk painting. A lot of times everything is alive. So trains will be alive, buildings. There are multiple pages where a train acts as kind of a border to panels, but is also made of animals and also has people inside. So there's kind of playing with what representation means. There's play with what a page composition can be. And there's play with how do you speak for someone without them being present. So we see the words of Ambedkar on the page, and we also have people talking about those words. And we also have Ambedkar on the page as part of a kind of tree form speaking to us. So sometimes it's about what you're trying to do. Sometimes it's about what you're trying to evoke. Sometimes it's about the form itself. So another aspect of tradition that I would say is much more comicsy is the anthology. A lot of comics works are in anthology form in India. Part of that comes out of these earlier comic books, which often had multiple works by multiple creators, so that there could be shorter stories, or they were paired with prose, poetry, commentary. But also there are international kinds of precedents here where Control-Alt, Shift unmasks corruption, and when Kubushan Matstakli paired non-Indian creators with Indian creators to create stories about that encounter or about social issues. So I'm going to wrap up by just pointing out some of the ways that these experimentation and political threads get intertwined. I want to make sure there's at least a little bit of time to ask some questions, because sure, a bunch of you have some questions. So there's experimentation for experimentation's sake. This is by Nair. This is specifically his kind of one of his surreal comics where we see bodies melting, structures reforming, very much pulling in surrealism from a lot of different traditions. There's also creators like Kritika Susarla who are clearly making comics for social media, for online platforms, while also making commentary about political and social problems. Like the Modi regime, like Islamophobia, like a lot of the attacks that have happened against people for eating meat in India. She's also done work creating other kinds of image-based mediations, like creating alphabets about gender and sexuality. And these are partially tailored to the platform, right, of online social media, quick communication, educating people through that. There are also folks like Arti Parthasarathi who've taken existing forms and reinterpreted them. So her Royal Existentials comic strip takes these miniature paintings and then puts stories into them by sampling, and then creates new kinds of storytelling from an older medium of art. There's also folks who are creating zines and comics where the form itself dictates, the content itself dictates the form, and kind of vice versa. One of my favorites is Unfolding the Sari, where we have a sari-shaped zine explaining the history of the sari and how it has a socio-political context. In this example, the creators were trying to bring in the original language of a trans person's kind of conversation with the interviewer, the author. And so they brought in the original language along with the translation by kind of innovating the form. So bringing in different kinds of ways of showing text in order to make sure that there was an understanding. This is translation. This is not that person's original words. Here's the original words so that you can hear them. There's also works like the Obliterary Journal that really question even what counts as comics. They show like sign painters, but they also have graffiti. There's a lot of different kinds of visual narratives that get included in anthologies like that, because they're not just about comics. And there's works like the Gacy Zine, which are pushing for different kinds of representation and a lot more formal innovation alongside better representation of queer and LGBTQIA+ more broadly within comic scenes. And last, I'll just point out that the Kadak Collective is a really exciting recent collective. They put out the Kadak Collective Anthology, the Bystander Anthology a couple of years ago, crowdfunded, did a lot of amazing work on that. All right, so I want to just pause there. If you're interested in Kadak, definitely look them up. You should be able to find a copy of the Bystander Anthology fairly easily. But I do want to open things up for some questions.
Start. I'm going to be repeating it into the Hey, one thing I want to ask, seems that a wide variety of art from a whole bunch of comics I've never seen, sure. One place I see Indian names constantly, major numbers, is at the end credits movie. So are some of the artists involved with comics?
At what?
The end credits.
Okay, yeah.
Ending and all of it. So are some of the artists involved in all of this? Did they sometimes, or have they also intertwined with media, film, and such? It's such a huge industry. I wonder if they cross home.
Okay, so the question here is that you tend to see a lot of Indian names at the end credits of films. That seems like there's a lot of Indian people involved in the film industry. And the person's asking whether there's any sort of kind of Venn diagram crossover of people working in comics in India and also working in the film industry that you're aware
Oh
of.
yeah, yeah, definitely. For one, I think that we tend to view things too much through the lens of nation state. Most of the creators that I cited in that last slide, a lot of them are based in the US or have moved to the US or been in the US at different times. So for instance, of the Kata Collective, I think Rishu Singh is in Australia. I know Shreyas Krishnan, who I'm working with right now, who worked with Kata Collective, is actually at the University of Illinois not University of Illinois. What am I saying? University of Washington, St. Louis. And so people aren't just staying in India, they're moving around, they're taking the work that they can get. An important piece of context here is that it is really difficult to get an illustration degree in India. You really have to do design. And so a lot of folks come to the US or elsewhere to get their degrees. But in terms of film specifically, there is a lot of overlap. Part of that is that there's kind of a history of filmmakers and film companies mediating comics in India. One of the more controversial ones is Priya Shakti, which was created by a New York-based filmmaker, but then marketed as India's first comic superhero, which was just bad marketing. They did better on their second and third issue. But there's definitely a lot of filmmakers who get into comics because they see it as either a kind of additional medium for their work, or they see it as a way to market to get a film better attention or to kind of jumpstart a project. There's also a lot of comics makers who work in film because that's where they started. So I think Sarnath Banerjee was doing some film work. I know that Arti Parthasarathi works with Falana Films, is one of, I believe, the co-founders of Falana Films. A lot of folks in comics in India do work in film. And a lot of folks in the US who work in comics end up working in film and related media as well, though. So it's less kind of about India uniquely and more about the larger industries.
Any other questions? Sure.
It's interesting to hear that these artists are sort of living or based in other places in the world. I was wondering if, if there are comics that are being released within the country, is there some sort of agency that sort of regulates the content of the comics in the same way that the states do? Something that sort of says what the content is.
In India?
Yes.
Okay, so this question is about whether there is any kind of, he noted that some of these creators are working actually outside of India. He was wondering whether there is any kind of internal agency in India that sort of regulates the content of comics. I'm thinking kind of like the motion, like ratings on motion pictures or the old comics code.
No, not really. There is a lot of self-censorship in many cases. So there was a really wonderful online comic that was published in physical form called Tiger on Land, Crocodile in Water, I think, which was published anonymously by two creators because it was so political that they were worried about backlash. There's a lot of concerns around the Modi regime in particular, that people may face violence. There's concerns for queer creators because for a long time it was illegal to be queer in India. And there's still the potential for attacks and backlash against trans and other queer folks. There's potential risk for a lot of folks of different marginalized identities. So if you are a Muslim Indian making comics in India right now, it is tricky to say the least. There's a lot of xenophobia, there's a lot of potential for backlash and violence. So there's not really, to my knowledge, I don't know that there's ever been a specific body that regulated the content of these comics. A lot of times it did come down to who was publishing them. So a particular publisher or individual in charge might not be interested in publishing certain things. Anant Pai, for instance, there's some articles talking about how he could be kind of tricky to work with as an editor for the Amar Chitrakatha series. But there's also really well-known editors in India, much like there are in the North American comics, I'm forgetting. There was one in particular who really pushed for the publication of a lot of these early graphic novels, and I'm forgetting her name. She's a badass. Dang it. But any case, there's no real one body. It's more often kind of situational or about the particular publisher or context.
All right, we've got about 2 minutes. So if someone has a quick question, yes.
You mentioned a couple of times, Jeremy, that it might be very hard for us to find certain comics. I was wondering what those barriers are, if it's translation or there are other reasons.
Yeah, so the question is, you had mentioned that it's very difficult sometimes to find these comics.
Yeah.
And they're wondering what the barrier is. Is it a translation issue? Is it distribution? Like, why is it so difficult to get Indian comics in the West?
A lot of it's kind of myriad. It's easier than ever, I will say. You can find a lot of these comics pretty easily on Amazon, on ABE Books, on a lot of these bigger sites, which aren't necessarily always the most ethical to use, but they are available. It's easier now than ever because a lot of these publishers have figured out that there's a little bit of a market here. A lot of the graphic novels in particular are published by Penguin, and HarperCollins, and it's their India branches, so it's not too hard to bring them over. But the barrier generally is that a lot of the publishers are smaller. So for instance, there's this fantastic publisher in India called Blast Publications, and they put out a couple of really great comics works, as well as some cool collections of ghost stories and other neat stuff, pulp fiction, but they have a hard time getting distribution in North America because it's costly to send those books across. They do currently have a connection, I think, based out of California. I could be wrong, but they're trying to get better distribution. It's just really difficult when you are a small publisher to get that kind of distribution internationally. Another part of the barrier is that some of these print runs weren't very large. Also, there's been some really shady kind of publisher buyouts. So one book by Amrita Patil was not available for, I think a year or two, maybe longer than that, because the publisher was bought up by Amazon, and so there was no likelihood they were going to republish that book. That would be, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was one of her most recent books. She finally got it republished with a different publisher, and they were able to bring it out again. So it can be something as tricky as a particular buyout. It can be about a particular publisher not giving the rights. It can be, even in some cases, I know that part of what delayed the River of Stories republication to make it available to a larger audience was that some of the original artworks were destroyed in a flood. So there's a lot of stuff that can get in the way, honestly.
All right, folks, well, we are about at time. Thank you to Dr. Stoll.